My name is Sarah Chen. I'm 28 years old, and until 3 months ago, I believed I knew exactly who I was. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, unremarkable except for the vintage postmark and my grandmother's familiar handwriting. I almost threw it away, assuming it was another one of her rambling stories about the old country. But something made me pause, perhaps the weight of the envelope or the way my name was written with unusual care. When I tore it open, my hands trembling for reasons I couldn't explain, everything I thought I knew about my family crumbled like autumn leaves. The first line read, "Sarah, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and it's time you learned the truth about your mother." My breath caught in my throat. My mother had died in a car accident when I was 5, or so I'd been told my entire life. The coffee mug slipped from my fingers, shattering against the kitchen floor as I continued reading. "Your mother didn't die in any accident. She was murdered, and the man who killed her has been living under our roof for 23 years. The words blurred before my eyes. The man she was referring to could only be my stepfather, David, the only father figure I'd ever known. The same man who had tucked me into bed, taught me to drive, and walked me down the aisle at my wedding just 2 years ago. My legs gave way, and I found myself sitting on the cold tiles, surrounded by broken ceramic and the ruins of everything I believed about my life. The letter continued with details that made my stomach churn. Grandmother had suspected David from the beginning, but she had no proof, only a mother's intuition and fragments of inconsistent stories. She wrote about how David had appeared at our door just days after my mother's funeral, offering comfort and support to a grieving family. How quickly he had integrated himself into our lives, marrying my Aunt Martha within 6 months. The timeline had always seemed rushed, but grief makes people do strange things, or so I'd rationalized. Now, reading my grandmother's careful documentation of inconsistencies, I saw a different pattern. David had known details about my mother's last day that he shouldn't have known. He had been the one to suggest the cremation, claiming my mother had wanted it, though she had never expressed such wishes. Most damning was the insurance policy, a substantial sum that David had helped my mother purchase just weeks before her death. My hands shook as I absorbed each revelation. The grandmother I remembered as sometimes confused and forgetful had actually been conducting a careful investigation for over 2 decades. She had been protecting me, she wrote, waiting until I was old enough and strong enough to handle the truth. But why now? Why had she waited so long, and why reveal it in a letter after her death? The answer came in the final paragraph. "I'm dying, Sarah, and he knows I suspect him. I fear I may not have much time left. Find Detective Rodriguez. He has the evidence I collected. Trust no one else, especially not David." Detective Rodriguez was retired, living in a small apartment across town. When I called, his voice carried the weariness of someone who had seen too much darkness in the world. He agreed to meet me at a coffee shop, choosing a corner table where we could speak privately. He was smaller than I'd imagined, with gentle eyes that had witnessed countless tragedies. When I showed him the letter, his expression shifted from curiosity to grim recognition. He pulled out a weathered file folder, its edges worn from years of handling. "Your grandmother came to me 15 years ago," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She had suspicions, fragments of evidence, but never enough for charges. The case had been closed, ruled accidental. David's story was consistent, he had alibis, and there were no witnesses. But my grandmother had been persistent, visiting him annually with new observations, small inconsistencies that individually meant nothing but collectively painted a troubling picture. Rodriguez had helped her document everything, knowing that someday it might matter. The folder contained photographs, witness statements, financial records, and timeline reconstructions. As we went through each piece of evidence, a chilling portrait emerged of a man who had systematically planned and executed my mother's murder, then seamlessly inserted himself into our family's grief to avoid suspicion. The most disturbing revelation was that David had been having an affair with my Aunt Martha for months before my mother's death, providing motive for what had initially appeared to be a random tragedy. Rodriguez explained that my grandmother had been secretly recording conversations with David for years, hoping he might let something slip in an unguarded moment. She had hidden recording devices throughout the house, documenting his reactions when certain topics arose. Some recordings were revealing, others merely confirmed his careful nature, but one stood out. It was from last Christmas, when David had been drinking and thought everyone was asleep. In it, he could be heard talking to someone on the phone, discussing the chin problem and how the old woman knew too much. The voice on the other end was unclear, but David's responses suggested he was being pressured to take action. "She won't live much longer anyway," David had said, "but if she tries to cause trouble, I'll handle it like I handled Linda." Linda was my mother's name. Rodriguez played the recording twice, and each time I felt physically sick hearing the casual way David discussed my mother's murder and threatened my grandmother. The detective's investigation had revealed that David had significant debts before my mother's death, gambling problems that had put him in dangerous situations. My mother's life insurance, combined with his position in our family, had solved multiple problems at once. He had gained financial security, eliminated witnesses to his activities, and positioned himself within a respectable family that provided perfect cover. The premeditation was breathtaking in its calculated cruelty. Everything about our family life had been built on a foundation of murder and lies, and I had been unknowingly living with my mother's killer for over 2 decades. Returning home that evening, I studied David with new eyes. He was in his usual spot, reading the newspaper in his favorite chair, looking like the picture of domestic tranquility. The man I had called Dad for 23 years, who had comforted me through heartbreaks, celebrated my achievements, and given me away at my wedding. How had I never seen it? How had none of us seen it? But that was the point, I realized. David was a master manipulator who had spent decades perfecting his performance as the devoted stepfather and husband. Every kindness, every gesture of love, had been calculated to maintain his cover and ensure our loyalty. I excused myself early, claiming exhaustion, but I lay awake all night planning my next moves. Rodriguez had explained that the evidence, while compelling, might not be sufficient for prosecution after so many years. Statutes of limitations didn't apply to murder, but proving a case that had been closed decades ago would be challenging. The recordings were promising, but David's lawyer would likely argue they were taken without consent and might be inadmissible. We needed more concrete evidence, something that would force David to confess or reveal additional information. Rodriguez suggested I consider wearing a wire, trying to engage David in conversations that might incriminate him further. The idea terrified me, but I owed it to my mother, to my grandmother, and to my own sense of justice. I had to know the complete truth, no matter how dangerous it might be to uncover it. Over the next week, I began subtly probing David about my mother and those early days after her death. I framed my questions as grief processing, explaining that turning 30 had made me reflect on my childhood and the family I'd lost. David seemed comfortable with these conversations, even eager to share memories of my mother and his role in helping our family heal. His stories were detailed and convincing, painting himself as a devoted friend who had stepped up during our darkest hour. But I listened now with trained ears, noting inconsistencies and gaps in his narratives. When I asked about specific dates and times, his answers sometimes contradicted previous versions. When I mentioned details from Rodriguez's file, David's body language shifted almost imperceptibly. He was still performing, but the performance required more effort now. Rodriguez had given me a small recording device, no larger than a button, which I wore during these conversations. Each evening, I would listen to the recordings, analyzing tone and content for anything that might be useful. The breakthrough came when I mentioned finding some of my grandmother's old papers, claiming I'd discovered references to concerns she'd had about my mother's accident. David's reaction was immediate and telling. His face flushed, his hands clenched, and for just a moment, the mask slipped. "Your grandmother was a troubled woman in her final years," he said, his voice carrying a hardness I'd never heard before. "You shouldn't put too much stock in whatever paranoid fantasies she might have written down." The word paranoid struck me as particularly revealing. I had never mentioned what kind of concerns grandmother had expressed, yet David immediately characterized them as paranoid fantasies. Someone innocent would have asked for details or expressed surprise. David's response suggested he knew exactly what concerns she might have had, which implied guilt. I pressed further, mentioning that I was thinking of having the papers reviewed by someone who might understand them better. David's agitation increased visibly. He began asking specific questions about what I'd found, where the papers were, and who I might show them to. His interest seemed far more intense than simple curiosity about a deceased family member's writings. That night, I heard David on the phone again, speaking in hushed tones after he thought everyone was asleep. I crept closer to his study door, holding my breath as I listened. He was telling someone that the situation might be becoming complicated and that he might need to take more direct action soon. The voice on the other end was clearer this time, and I recognized it as his brother Marcus, someone I'd always considered a harmless uncle figure. They were discussing contingency plans, ways to discredit any allegations that might emerge, and methods for ensuring that problematic evidence disappeared permanently. The conversation confirmed my worst fears while revealing that David wasn't acting alone. He had accomplices, people who had helped him maintain his deception for decades and were prepared to help him protect it now. Marcus arrived at our house the next morning, ostensibly for a casual visit, but I could see the tension in both men. They spent hours in David's study, their voices too low for me to hear clearly, but their body language spoke of urgent planning. When Marcus left, David seemed more relaxed, which frightened me more than his previous agitation. Whatever they had decided, it had given him confidence. I called Rodriguez immediately, reporting the overnight phone conversation and Marcus's visit. The detective's voice grew grave as he processed this information. "Sarah, I think you need to consider that they might be planning something against you directly," he said. "If they believe you're getting too close to the truth, they might decide you're a threat that needs to be eliminated." The thought hadn't occurred to me, but it made terrible sense. David had killed to protect his secret once before, and he had demonstrated his willingness to threaten anyone who might expose him. I was no longer just his stepdaughter seeking closure about her mother's death. I was a potential witness who could destroy everything he built. Rodriguez insisted I needed protection, but going to the police officially would require explaining evidence that might not hold up in court. We were in a dangerous limbo, knowing enough to be certain of David's guilt but not enough to ensure conviction. The detective suggested I consider leaving town temporarily while he worked on building a stronger case, but I refused to run. My mother had never had the chance to fight back. I wouldn't abandon the opportunity to seek justice for her murder. Rodriguez agreed to help me set up more sophisticated surveillance of David's activities. We needed to catch him in more explicitly incriminating conversations or document contact with accomplices who might be willing to testify in exchange for immunity. The detective had contacts within the police department who owed him favors, people who could provide technical assistance without asking too many questions about ongoing investigations. Within 2 days, we had monitoring equipment installed in David's car and study, places where he was most likely to have unguarded conversations. The first few days yielded nothing significant, routine calls about work and family obligations. But on Friday evening, everything changed. David received a call that sent him into a panic. The voice on the other end was angry, threatening, demanding immediate payment of debts that David apparently couldn't cover. The caller referenced what happened to Linda and suggested that David's current family might face similar consequences if the money wasn't found quickly. David's responses revealed a man trapped between his past crimes and current threats, someone who had thought he was safe but was discovering that murder creates complications that never fully disappear. The caller was clearly blackmailing David, using knowledge of my mother's murder as leverage. This created both opportunity and danger for our investigation. The blackmailer might be willing to provide evidence in exchange for immunity, but they also represented an additional threat to anyone seeking to expose David's crimes. Rodriguez and I analyzed the recording carefully, trying to identify the blackmailer's voice and understand the full scope of their demands. The caller had mentioned specific details about my mother's death that hadn't been made public, suggesting either direct involvement or access to inside information. They also demonstrated knowledge of David's current financial situation and family circumstances, indicating ongoing surveillance or contact with someone close to our household. The detective ran the voice through analysis software, comparing it to recordings of known criminals from cold cases around the time of my mother's death. We got a match: Vincent Torino, a loan shark who had disappeared shortly after my mother's murder, presumably fleeing to avoid prosecution on unrelated charges. Torino had apparently returned and was now pressuring David for payment on decades-old debts. The timing suggested he might have been involved in planning my mother's murder, possibly as the creditor whose threats had motivated David's actions. This revelation provided both the missing piece of our puzzle and a potential path to justice. If we could locate Torino and convince him to testify against David, we might finally have the evidence needed for prosecution. But approaching a dangerous criminal who had been hiding for decades would require careful planning and significant risk. Rodriguez began reaching out to his contacts in organized crime units, trying to locate Torino without alerting him to our interest. Meanwhile, I continued monitoring David, who was becoming increasingly desperate as Torino's demands escalated. David's desperation manifested in increasingly erratic behavior. He began staying out late, making mysterious trips that he claimed were work-related but involved no verifiable business activities. His phone calls became more frequent and agitated, often conducted in his car where he thought he had privacy. Through our surveillance, we learned he was attempting to borrow money from various sources, including loan sharks even more dangerous than Torino. Each conversation revealed more about his original crimes and current predicament. He owed money to people who solved collection problems through violence, and his family had become potential collateral in their debt recovery calculations. The recordings captured David discussing contingency plans that included fleeing the country, abandoning the family he had manipulated for decades, and leaving us to face consequences for his choices. Listening to him casually plan our abandonment while discussing the murder of my mother filled me with rage unlike anything I'd ever experienced. This man had stolen my mother's life, corrupted my childhood with lies, and was now prepared to destroy what remained of our family to save himself. Rodriguez could see the anger consuming me and worried I might do something reckless that would compromise our investigation. He reminded me that justice required patience and careful planning, that acting on emotion would only help David escape accountability. But patience was becoming increasingly difficult as I watched him manipulate my Aunt Martha, who still believed completely in his innocence and devotion. The breakthrough came when Torino made a mistake. During one of his threatening calls to David, he mentioned a specific location where they had met years ago, a warehouse that had since been converted to apartments. Rodriguez used this information to track down property records and surveillance footage from nearby businesses. We discovered that Torino had been living under an assumed name just 20 miles away, working as a maintenance supervisor and apparently trying to live a legitimate life until financial pressures drove him back to his criminal contacts. The detective arranged a meeting through intermediaries, offering Torino immunity in exchange for testimony about David's crimes. The negotiation was delicate, requiring Rodriguez to convince a paranoid criminal that cooperation was safer than continued silence. Torino initially refused, claiming he knew nothing about any murder and was simply collecting legitimate debts. But when presented with evidence of his voice on the recordings and the threat of prosecution for extortion, he began to reconsider his position. The breakthrough came when Rodriguez revealed that David was actively trying to locate Torino to eliminate him as a threat. Phone records showed David had been calling known associates, offering money for information about Torino's whereabouts. Faced with the choice between testifying against David or potentially being killed by him, Torino chose cooperation. His account of my mother's murder was devastating in its clinical detail and David's calculated cruelty. Torino's confession revealed the full scope of David's crimes and the cold-blooded planning that had preceded my mother's death. David had borrowed money to cover gambling debts, using my mother's jewelry as collateral. When he couldn't repay the loan, Torino had threatened to expose David's financial problems to my mother, which would have resulted in divorce and financial ruin. David had approached Torino with a proposal. Instead of public exposure, they would arrange an accident that would allow David to collect my mother's life insurance and pay his debts while maintaining his reputation. The plan was elaborate and cruel, designed to appear like a random carjacking gone wrong. David had lured my mother to an isolated area under the pretense of meeting a client for her real estate business. Torino and another accomplice had been waiting there, but instead of a simple robbery, they had killed her on David's explicit instructions. David had paid them from the insurance money, then helped Torino disappear when police started investigating connections between the victim and known criminals. The confession explained details that had puzzled investigators for decades, including how David had managed to establish alibis while still being involved in the crime. Torino also revealed that David had killed before, making my mother's murder part of a pattern rather than an isolated incident of desperation. The accomplice who had helped kill my mother had been found dead in an apparent overdose just months later, another loose end that David had methodically eliminated. Armed with Torino's testimony and supporting evidence, Rodriguez felt confident approaching the district attorney about reopening my mother's case. The combination of recorded confessions, witness testimony, and circumstantial evidence created a compelling argument for prosecution. But David was growing increasingly suspicious of my behavior, and Rodriguez worried that he might flee before charges could be filed. We decided to accelerate our timeline, setting up a final confrontation that would force David to reveal additional incriminating information while ensuring he couldn't escape. The plan required me to confront David directly about my mother's murder, wearing recording equipment to capture his response. Rodriguez would be nearby with backup, ready to intervene if David became violent. The risk was significant, but we needed David's own words to complete our case. I chose to approach him on a Sunday evening when Aunt Martha was visiting friends, ensuring that only David and I would be present for the conversation. My heart pounded as I entered his study, where he was reviewing financial documents with the intensity of a man running out of options. When I placed my grandmother's letter on his desk and asked him to explain why she thought he had killed my mother, his face went through a series of expressions: surprise, calculation, anger, and finally, resignation. For a moment, I thought he might simply deny everything, but the weight of decades of deception seemed to crush his resistance. David's confession was more complete than I had dared hope for. Perhaps sensing that his carefully constructed life was finally collapsing, he seemed almost relieved to finally tell the truth about what he had done. He admitted to planning my mother's murder, detailed his financial motivations, and revealed the extent of his manipulation of our family's grief. But his account also included justifications that revealed the depth of his narcissism and lack of remorse. He claimed my mother had been difficult about money, that she would have ruined everything if she had discovered his debts, and that killing her had actually protected the family from financial disaster. He spoke about the murder as if it had been a reasonable business decision, showing no recognition of the lives he had destroyed or the decades of trauma he had inflicted. Most chillingly, he expressed pride in how skillfully he had managed to avoid suspicion, describing his integration into our family as a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. When I asked about my grandmother, he confirmed that he had been planning to kill her too, viewing her suspicions as a threat that needed to be eliminated. Only her natural death had prevented him from committing a second murder within our family. As David spoke, I could hear Rodriguez and his team positioning themselves outside, preparing to arrest him on multiple charges including murder, conspiracy, and extortion. The recording device captured every word of his confession, providing the final piece of evidence needed to ensure his conviction. The arrest was swift and decisive, David offering no resistance when confronted by Rodriguez and the other officers. He seemed almost relieved that the charade was finally over, that he no longer had to maintain the exhausting performance of being our loving family patriarch. As they led him away in handcuffs, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: vindication for my mother and grandmother, grief for the family relationships that had been built on lies, and anger at the years of deception we had all lived through. Aunt Martha was devastated when she learned the truth, struggling to reconcile the man she had loved and trusted with the cold-blooded killer he actually was. Our family relationships required complete reconstruction, built now on truth rather than manipulation. The trial lasted 6 months, with Torino's testimony providing crucial evidence about the premeditated nature of my mother's murder. David was convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. During the sentencing, he showed no remorse, maintaining that his actions had been justified by circumstances beyond his control. But justice had finally been served, and my mother could rest in peace knowing that her killer would never hurt anyone else. I kept my grandmother's letter, a reminder of her courage in pursuing truth despite personal danger. Her investigation had taken 23 years to reach its conclusion, but it had ultimately provided the evidence needed to expose David's crimes and honor my mother's memory. Everything had indeed changed the day I opened that letter, transforming not just my understanding of the past but my commitment to ensuring that truth and justice would always matter more than comfortable lies.